Having taken part in 8 Ludum Dare games over the years, we here at Buried Things have learned some important lessons about achieving success for your game in such an unforgiving timeframe. Some lessons came to us as unexpected joys and made for some respectably rated jam entries, while others will learn the hard way from half-finished, semi-incomprehensible projects that barely passed for functional games. If you go looking for jam advice, you'll hear plenty of people talk about preparing meals before the jam begins, getting enough sleep, scoping your game small enough, and that's all generally good advice. But in this video we'll be going into some more detail about some of the qualities of a game that will be enjoyed and well received beyond the basics of just being fun and looking and sounding good. Number 1. Make a game that speaks for itself. When was the last time you bought a game on disc, let alone read the manual that came with it? Well, that's what this is. Your game jam page is your manual. Don't use it as a tutorial for your game. People appreciate a game that can speak for itself. It makes the whole experience feel more polished and cohesive when you can learn how to play the game by playing the game. And nobody wants to interrupt their experience to go back to the submission page and remind themselves of the controls, or worse, what they're even supposed to be doing. Teaching the player with your game's UI beats teaching them on your game page. And teaching your player through the gameplay is better still. At a minimum, this beats this. But even better, it's a smoother and more satisfying experience for a player to feel like they learned for themselves how to play the game. In our Ludum Dare 46 game waiver, the player is shown a crowd in an unusual arrangement, and are shown that this green person here can be controlled with the E key. Then after a couple waves, a new person highlights, and players realise that E doesn't control the new person. We let them make the connection for themselves that the crowd represents the keyboard, which was an epiphany that a lot of players found to be the coolest moment in the game. Number 2. Add some juice. Our very first jam game, Latvian Milk, was a wave-based arena shooter. We were almost new to game dev and completely new to game jams, so while we managed to make a functional game that was playable from start to finish, it was very light on the content. The arena had no obstacles, and the hazards amounted to explosive barrels and 2 kinds of enemy. After you see the second enemy type, nothing changes about each wave, except for a linear increase in the number of enemies and barrels. At least the 2 enemies were totally different from one another though. One runs slowly at the player and attacks at close range, while the other runs slowly at the player and attacks at kinda close range. And despite the fact that it takes about 20 seconds to see an exhaustive display of all the challenges Latvian Milk has to offer, we bagged a rating of 11th most fun game out of about 2,000 jam entries in Ludum Dare 32. How? By filling our game so full of juice that it tricked people's brains into having fun. Juice is hard to define, but a large part of it is about giving immediate feedback to player inputs, which is punchy, snappy, smooth, satisfying. Some of the things we did in Latvian Milk can apply to any game. Screen shake, for instance, just makes everything better. Put screen shake in your games, people. Instant feedback to player actions too should be done as much as possible. Having a button change visually and play a sound when hovered over or clicked. A camera which moves a little bit in the direction of the cursor. And in our case, firing your gun is made to feel powerful by pushing the player back a little every time you fire. A couple more specific examples for us as well were dead bodies that would accumulate as enemies died, giant guns and bullets bigger than the player themselves that would physically knock into and move enemies, and explosive chain reactions. People really notice this stuff. It's not just us that refer to Latvian Milk as juicy. We even got a few direct comparisons to Vlambir, who are known for making games bursting with juice. Which we took as a compliment given that our entire goal in this jam was to shamelessly rip off the unique feel of Vlambir games. Number 3. Get it working early. In the past, this is one we've both done well with and been burned by. Don't rely on everything coming together at the end of the jam, because it doesn't take much to scupper your plans and leave parts of your game short of functional. You will have all kinds of cool ideas bouncing around at the start of the jam, and it's tempting to try and include every interesting detail you've come up with as you go. Resist this urge at the outset, and instead focus on what the smallest working version of your idea would be, and hit that first. This helps ensure that regardless of your development speed, any unforeseen obstacles, and the eventual size of your game, you at least have a cohesive final product that, similar to my first point, stands on its own. Smaller, complete ideas make for a better experience than bigger, partially unfinished ones, no matter how cool you think your grand plans are. We have a few ideas to offer on this point, the first of which you'll have heard if you've ever heard anyone talk about game jam tips, and that's scope. Scope down. Scope way down. Everyone overscopes. We overscope. People with 10 years of jam experience under their belts overscope. Your idea cannot be too small. It's impossible. Because even if by some miracle you manage to complete your original idea in its entirety, you can always add more polish, more levels, more music. You can add settings, controller support, colorblind mode, achievements, collectibles, persistent save files, the list goes on. The second jam we ever did fell way short in this department. The original scoped idea could be described as an open-world roguelike space exploration shipbuilding strategy game. Needless to say, we didn't quite reach this frankly laughable scope, and because we didn't try to get a simple version of this working early, it's not even like we ended up with a playable game that only managed one or two of these. No, of course not, it was a broken mess. Besides the scope of your game, something else to consider is its modularity. This has been our biggest breakthrough as a team over the last couple of jams. Back in April, we made a game called Fishy Lake. Or more appropriately, we failed to make a game called Fishy Lake. One of the main contributing factors was our team of three constantly bottlenecking each other, all wanting to make changes to the main stage of the game, but only being able to do so one at a time. There were definitely workflow problems generally with our approach, but a big part of the problem was that we were unable to isolate aspects of the game for development, so that we as a team could work in parallel. We took this lesson to heart, and for Ludum Dare 49, just gone, we instead decided to go ultra-modular with our game Jingoku, making a collection of microgames all framed around one central mechanic. This meant that from the outset, all three of us could just break away, working on either the main mechanic or on an individual microgame in seamless parallel work streams. And the success of this structure and approach shines through in just the sheer amount of content in the final game. Jingoku has 13 microgames plus the main game, complete to a high level of polish, plus online leaderboards, achievements, and save files. Modularity doesn't just apply to teams though. Even as a solo developer, it's also a way to approach the idea of getting the game working early. A simple core idea from which you can hang interesting new content and features with minimal interdependence is another great strategy when you're striving for a game that feels complete and has as few loose ends as possible. The most obvious example of that is a game with levels. Once your core mechanics are functional and fun, you can add levels up until deadline if you want. It doesn't matter if you make 3 or 10 or 20, the game will feel complete, as long as you don't leave in half a level. However, it is fair to say that modularity is harder to apply to some kinds of games than others. A puzzle game with levels is clearly more modular than a narrative-driven exploration game. So you don't have to think of it strictly in terms of modules, but it is still a good idea to get the most minimal version of your game working first, before adding the bells and whistles. You might have heard of this concept in software development before as the steel thread. If you like, you could even try scheduling times where you aim to have a working, playable iteration of your game from start to finish, no matter how bare bones that might be. Maybe every 4 hours or every day, for instance, you should be able to play through your game without encountering anything that doesn't function due to incompleteness. For clarity here, let's say that you have a boss fight at the end of your game, where you want the boss to have 3 different phases, each with 5 different attacks. Having a boss with 1 phase and 2 attacks would be a totally acceptable iteration that does not count as incomplete. What you should be able to do is deal damage to the boss, have their health reduced to 0, and be able to get past them and reach the end of the game. The boss should be randomly choosing between the attacks without getting stuck using one over and over again. The boss can be simple, but it doesn't require more work to be functional, only to be more interesting. If worst comes to worst and deadline arrives, you could publish the game with the boss in this state and people could play it. No warning required on your submission page that, oh, by the way, the boss at the end doesn't die, and when its health reaches 0, you can Alt F4 your way out of the game. Finally, number 4, assuming you've got your rock-solid functional game loop done first, some polish is always great. Intro splashes and credit screens can really give you some legitimacy. Panning your audio where appropriate, or slightly randomizing the pitch of frequent sounds can boost your audio quality for a relatively small amount of work. Some simple post-processing effects like ambient occlusion or a subtle vignette can give your game some extra atmosphere. In almost all cases, a jam game is essentially a prototype for a bigger idea. But when it comes to people enjoying your game, there's a lot of value in making your game look as little like a prototype as possible. Our best rated Ludum Dare games have definitely been the ones where players have not been able to see below that glossy surface of the game at the grisly gem quality code and the shortcuts we've taken beneath the surface. Even in cases where our lower rated games have arguably had more novel and innovative ideas. It's great if your game looks and sounds awesome, of course, but the main takeaway from this video is that people also really appreciate completeness when playing jam games. It makes for a satisfying experience and leaves a lasting impression.